There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday afternoon or a simple question. They don't announce themselves with thunder or trumpets. They slip in through an unlocked door, a moment of silence, a shared glance that lasts a second too long. They are the moments that, in retrospect, become the steel hinges upon which your entire life swings. For me, that moment smelled of old paper and the rain that had been threatening all day. It was the moment I found him sitting on the floor of my bedroom, my life held open in his hands. He didn't look up with shame or panic. His gaze was steady, lost in the ink, and when he finally did look at me, standing frozen in the doorway, he simply pointed a single, steady finger at the middle of the right-hand page. And he asked, "Is this about me?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, trembling thing. It wasn't an accusation. It was quieter than that, softer. It was a genuine inquiry, laced with a kind of bewildered hope that terrified me more than any anger could have. Because in his eyes, I didn't see a man who had violated my privacy. I saw a man who had been searching for something, and was afraid, and perhaps thrilled, that he had finally found it. My diary, the one I kept tucked under a loose floorboard beneath my desk, was not a book of secrets so much as a mausoleum for feelings I never intended to act upon. It was a collection of captured light, fleeting expressions, and the silent, aching architecture of my love for him. And he had found the key. He had walked through its halls. And now he was standing in the central chamber, pointing at the inscription on the sarcophagus and asking for a translation. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer, catastrophic gravity of his question, you have to understand the silence that came before it. You have to understand the geography of our friendship. I met Julian during my second year of university. I was reclusive by nature, a creature of shadow and observation, most comfortable behind the lens of my camera where I could frame the world without having to fully participate in it. He was the opposite. Julian was a current, a force of nature disguised as a software engineering student. He moved through crowds with an unconscious grace, drawing people into his orbit not through effort, but through a kind of innate, radiant energy. He was all bright laughter and easy confidence, the kind of person I would typically photograph from a distance, an interesting study in light and motion, but never someone I would actually speak to. Our meeting was, like so much of our story, an accident of proximity. We were assigned as partners for a cross-disciplinary project that neither of us wanted to be in. Our task was to create a digital presentation on the intersection of art and technology. It was a profoundly boring topic, but it forced us into the same small study rooms in the library for hours on end. For the first week, our interactions were purely functional. I would analyze the aesthetics of user interfaces, and he would explain the code that made them work. I spoke in terms of composition and color theory. He spoke in algorithms and processing power. We were two different languages trying to describe the same object. I was convinced he found me painfully quiet, a strange, artistic recluse who thought too much and said too little. I, in turn, found him intimidatingly brilliant, his mind moving at a speed I couldn't quite track. The shift happened during one late-night session. We were both exhausted, staring blankly at a screen of code that had stubbornly refused to compile for the better part of an hour. The library was quiet, the air thick with the smell of dust and decaying paper. I was sketching a portrait of him in my notebook, a habit I couldn't break. I wasn't drawing the bright, confident student everyone else saw. I was drawing the fatigue in the corners of his eyes, the way his brow furrowed in frustration, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he reached for his coffee cup. I was drawing the cracks in the facade. He turned suddenly, catching me. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs, a hot flush creeping up my neck. I expected a joke or a demand to see it, the kind of casual violation of boundaries that extroverts sometimes engage in without a second thought. Instead, he just watched me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire week, and leaned back in his chair. "You see things, don't you, Leo?" he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I mean, really see them?" It wasn't a question expecting an answer. It was an observation. And it was the first time anyone had ever described my quietness not as a lack, but as a function. I didn't say anything. I just gave a small, hesitant nod. He smiled, a tired, genuine smile that was nothing like the bright, public one he usually wore. "Show me sometime," he said, turning back to the screen. What it is you see after that, something between us eased. The project became less of a chore and more of a conversation. We finished it, got a respectable grade, and I assumed we would drift back into our separate orbits. But we didn't. Julian started seeking me out. He'd appear at the door of the darkroom, his silhouette framed against the bright hallway, and just watch me work, asking quiet questions about the chemical baths and the slow, magical process of an image emerging on paper. He would invite me to parties, and when he saw me lingering at the edges, uncomfortable with the noise and the press of bodies, he wouldn't try to drag me into the center. Instead, he would bring the center to me, pulling up a patch of floor in a quiet corner, talking to me for hours while the chaos swirled around us, creating a small, insulated pocket of calm just for the two of us. He seemed to understand, without me ever having to explain it, that I wasn't antisocial. I was just selective. My camera and my love for him grew in tandem. He became my favorite subject, a constant source of fascination. I have hundreds of photos of him from that time. Julian, laughing with his head thrown back, sunlight catching in his dark hair. Julian, asleep on a pile of textbooks, his face serene and unguarded. Julian, staring out a window, lost in a thought he would never share. I was documenting the seasons of a person, and in the process, I was falling hopelessly, quietly in love with him. It was a silent, one-sided devotion, a feeling I packed away like old letters, stored in the attic of my heart. It was mine, and mine alone. It had to be. He was straight, for one thing. He dated women, beautiful and clever, and just as bright as he was. My feelings for him felt like a different language, one he would never understand, so I never tried to speak it. My friendship with him was a perfectly balanced, precious thing. It was a cathedral of quiet understanding, and my love was a secret prayer whispered in its nave. To speak it aloud would be to risk shattering the stained glass. So I kept quiet. After we graduated, the idea of not living in the same city felt like a physical amputation. It was Julian who suggested we get an apartment together. He presented it as a practical solution. "We both need a place. Rent is cheaper, and you're the only person I know who doesn't leave dirty dishes in the sink for a week," he'd said with a shrug. For him, it was about logistics. For me, it was a lifeline. We found a small, two-bedroom place with good natural light that poured into the living room in the late afternoons, perfect for my photography. He took a high-paying job as a consultant, which involved a lot of travel and high-stress projects. I pieced together a living with freelance work, portraits, and the occasional gallery submission. Our lives were different, but our home was a shared sanctuary. He would come home from a week-long business trip, shed his suit and his corporate persona at the door, and collapse onto the couch, and I would make him tea, and we would just sit in silence, the quiet comfort of our shared space rebuilding him piece by piece. He was dating a woman named Clara then. She was a lawyer, sharp and ambitious, and perfectly suited to his world of networking events and professional dinners. I liked her genuinely. She was kind to me, if a little baffled by my quiet profession and my seemingly permanent residence in Julian's life. But her presence was also a constant, low-grade ache. It was a reminder of the fundamental boundary between us, the uncrossable line. When she was at the apartment, the atmosphere shifted. It became their space, and I was a guest in it. The easy, domestic intimacy Julian and I shared would recede, replaced by a more formal politeness. I would retreat to my room, the door closing with a soft click that felt like a final, definitive barrier. I would hear their laughter from the living room, and the sound was a physical pain, a confirmation of my place on the outside. It was during this time that I started the diary. The floorboard under my desk was slightly warped, and one day, I pried it up to find a small, hollow space beneath. It felt like a secret waiting to be kept. I bought a simple, leather-bound journal and began to write. It wasn't for anyone else to read. It was for me. It was a place to decant the feelings that were threatening to overflow. I wrote about the way Julian's eyes would crinkle at the corners when he was truly amused. I wrote about the specific cadence of his footsteps in the hall, a sound I could distinguish from any other. I wrote about the ache of watching him leave with Clara, his hand on the small of her back. I described it all in the language I knew best, the language of light and shadow, of composition and negative space. I wrote about him as a study in contrast, the bright, public man and the quiet, tired one I saw when the world was shut out. The diary was my darkroom, the place where the overexposed, blinding reality of my love could be processed into something tangible, something I could look at and understand, even if I could never show it to anyone else. It was the only place I was not silent. This was the world that existed before that Tuesday afternoon. It was a world of carefully managed boundaries, of unspoken truths, of a love that lived and breathed only in the dark. It was a fragile peace, but it was a peace I had fiercely protected for years. And then, it all began to unravel. The shift began not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding dissolution. Julian and Claire's relationship had been fraying for months. I saw it in the way he started coming home later, the exhaustion on his face deeper than just work stress. I heard it in the hushed, tense phone calls he would take on the balcony, his back rigid. He never spoke about it directly, and I never asked. Our friendship was built on a foundation of respecting these closed doors. I was the safe harbor, the place he could return to without needing to explain the storms he had weathered out at sea. I offered silent solidarity, a cup of tea, a shared movie on the couch. I was the constant, the unchanging background against which the drama of his life played out. The end came on a rainy Thursday night. He came home drenched, without an umbrella, his suit soaked through. He walked past me in the living room without a word and went straight to his room, closing the door behind him. A few minutes later, I heard the faint, muffled sound of a single, choked sob. The sound was a violation of the natural order of our apartment. Julian was not a crier. He was the pillar, the steady one. Hearing him break was like watching a mountain crumble. I stood outside his door for a long time, my hand raised to knock, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like intruding on a sacred, private grief. Eventually, the sound stopped, and a profound silence fell over the apartment, heavier and more suffocating than any noise. The next morning, he emerged looking hollowed out. He made coffee in a slow, robotic trance, staring out the window at the gray city. "Clara and I are done," he said, his voice flat. He didn't offer details, and I didn't press for them. I just nodded and pushed a mug of coffee toward him. "I'm sorry," I said. The words felt ridiculously small, like offering a single grain of sand to fill a chasm. He just shook his head, a gesture of weary dismissal. That was the extent of our conversation about it. But everything changed after that day. The carefully constructed architecture of his life had collapsed, and he was left standing in the rubble, disoriented and untethered. And he turned to me, not as a friend, but as a landmark, a fixed point in the wreckage. At first, the changes were subtle. He stopped going out on weekends. Instead of bars and restaurants, our living room became his entire world. He would spend hours on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, sometimes watching a movie, sometimes just staring at the wall. He was present, physically, but his spirit was elsewhere, lost in some internal labyrinth of regret or confusion. I became his silent keeper. I would make sure he ate. I would put on a record, something soft and instrumental, to fill the oppressive silence. I tried to give him space while also letting him know he wasn't alone, a delicate, exhausting dance of proximity and distance. I felt like I was tending to a magnificent, wounded animal, something wild and beautiful that had been hurt, and I didn't know if my presence was a comfort or just a reminder of its cage. Then, the ritual began. It started one evening about 2 weeks after the breakup. We were watching some mindless action movie, a distraction he'd chosen. I was on my usual end of the large sectional sofa. He was on his. As the movie wore on, I noticed him shifting, restless. He moved closer, inch by inch, a slow, almost imperceptible drift across the vast expanse of gray upholstery. Eventually, his thigh was pressed against mine. My entire body went rigid. It was the most casual of touches, the kind friends might share without a thought. But for me, it was electric. It was a breach of the unspoken treaty that had governed our interactions for years. I held my breath, waiting for him to move away, to realize his mistake. But he didn't. He settled there, and after a few minutes, the tension in his body seemed to melt away. He let out a long, slow breath, and his head, as if too heavy to hold up any longer, came to rest on my shoulder. My mind went into a state of hyper-alertness. I was intensely aware of every single point of contact. The weight of his head, the warmth of his leg against mine, the soft fabric of his sweater brushing against my arm. I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean and citrusy. I sat there, ramrod straight, for what felt like an eternity, my heart beating a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I was a statue, terrified that any movement would shatter the moment. He wasn't asleep, not yet. He was just resting. He was borrowing my strength, my stillness. And I let him. I let him because I was a fool, and because the secret, selfish part of me that I kept locked away was screaming with a kind of desperate, painful joy. After an hour, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had finally found some peace, and he had found it against me. I didn't move until the credits rolled and the screen went black. I didn't move until my own muscles ached with the strain of holding perfectly still. Very carefully, I maneuvered him so he was lying down on the couch, and I covered him with a blanket before retreating to the safety of my own room, where I stood in the dark, my body still humming with the ghost of his touch. This became our new normal. It was a ritual that established itself without a single word being spoken. Every night, we would end up on the couch. And every night, he would gravitate toward me. Sometimes he would lay his head in my lap as I read. Sometimes he would curl up against my side, tucking his feet under the same blanket. He would fall asleep, and I would stay awake, his guardian in the quiet dark, my mind a chaotic storm of analysis and fear and a hope so sharp it was painful. I dissected every gesture. What did it mean? Was this just the desperate act of a lonely, heartbroken man seeking any port in a storm? Was I just a convenient, warm body, a substitute for the comfort he had lost? Or was it something more? Was it possible that in his grief, he was discovering a need he never knew he had, a need that only I could fill? I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety. Each evening was a tightrope walk over a canyon of unspoken feelings. I was terrified of misinterpreting his actions, of seeing intention where there was only instinct. If I were to lean into his touch, to return the pressure, to rest my own head on his, would he pull away? Would the spell be broken? It felt like I was a bomb disposal expert, and his sleeping body was the device. One wrong move, one tremor of reciprocation, and everything would detonate, destroying the fragile peace of our home, destroying the friendship I valued above all else. So I remained passive. I was a harbor, a wall, a sturdy piece of furniture. I allowed myself to be a source of comfort, but I never dared to seek it in return. My own loneliness was a vast, empty room, and I kept the door to it firmly locked. The ritual escalated. One night, he woke from a nightmare on the couch, gasping, his body rigid with fear. I sat up, my hand hovering over his shoulder, not knowing what to do. "Bad dream," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and panic. He looked around the dark living room as if it were a hostile landscape. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading in the faint glow of the streetlights from the window. "Leo," he whispered, and his voice was the voice of a child lost in the woods. "Can I don't want to be alone." My heart fractured. It feels too empty," he stammered, the confident, capable Julian I knew completely gone, replaced by this raw, vulnerable stranger. The unspoken question hung in the air. He wanted to sleep in my room. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicating. My room was my sanctuary, the place where my secret love was most concentrated, most real. The diary was under the floor. My photographs of him were tacked to a corkboard. It was a room saturated with my feelings for him. Letting him in felt like letting him read my soul. But looking at his face, at the genuine fear in his eyes, I couldn't say no. I couldn't be the person who turned him away when he was so clearly adrift. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's okay, Julian." He followed me down the short hallway like a shadow. My room was small, dominated by a queen-sized bed. There was no plausible deniability here, no way to pretend this was anything other than what it was, two people choosing to share a bed. He crawled under the covers on the far side, keeping a careful, respectful distance. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. I lay on mine, the space between us a roaring, electric void. Neither of us slept for a long time. I could hear his breathing, could feel the subtle shift of the mattress with his every movement. The silence was deafening. It was filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke, his voice soft in the darkness. "Thanks, Leo. It's okay," I repeated, the only words I seemed to have left. He rolled onto his side, facing away from me. I stayed on my back, listening to the sound of the city outside my window, my mind racing. This was a new frontier. We had crossed a boundary, and I had no map for the territory we were now in. This, too, became part of the ritual. Not every night, but often enough. On nights when he came home looking particularly worn down, or after a difficult phone call with his parents, he would just appear at my doorway, a pillow clutched in his hand, his expression a silent question. And I would always nod, moving over to make space for him. We never touched in the bed. We maintained that careful, chaste distance. But the intimacy of it was overwhelming. The simple act of sharing a breathing space through the night, of waking up and seeing his sleeping form beside me, was a kind of slow poison to my resolve. It fed the hope I was trying so desperately to starve. His door, which he used to close every night, was now perpetually left ajar, a silent invitation, a sign that the barrier between his world and mine was dissolving. I documented it all in my diary. I wrote about the weight of his head on my shoulder, trying to describe the specific blend of comfort and terror it induced. I wrote about the geography of my bed, the inches between us feeling like miles and millimeters all at once. I wrote about the sound of his breathing in the dark, a rhythm that was becoming as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I tried to be an objective observer, a photographer capturing a scene, but my own yearning bled into every word. The pages became saturated with it. The book was no longer a mausoleum. It was a hothouse, my feelings growing wild and untamed in the humid, secret air. I started hiding it more carefully, a new wave of paranoia washing over me. The thought of him ever finding it, ever reading those words, was mortifying. It would be the end of everything. The friendship, the fragile new intimacy, the quiet home we had built. It would all burn to the ground. This period felt like living in the moments just before a storm breaks. The air was thick and heavy with unspoken things, charged with a strange, electric potential. I was waiting for the lightning, for the inevitable crack of thunder that would either clear the air or set the whole world on fire. I was holding my breath, and I had been holding it for so long I was starting to forget how to breathe normally. The tension was becoming unsustainable. The ritual, which had started as a source of comfort for him, had become a source of exquisite torture for me. Every night was a test of my endurance, a reminder of everything I wanted and could not have. Something had to give. The silence had to break. The crossing happened on a Sunday night. It was late, close to midnight. A soft rain was falling outside, a gentle, rhythmic patter against the window panes that seemed to muffle the sounds of the city, enclosing our apartment in a bubble of quiet. We were in our usual positions on the couch, having long since abandoned the pretense of watching the movie that was playing. He was lying with his head in my lap, and I was absently running my fingers through his hair. It was a gesture I had started doing without thinking, my body finally betraying my mind's strict rules. To my astonishment, he hadn't flinched or pulled away. He had leaned into the touch, a soft, contented sigh escaping his lips. For the past hour, we had existed in this state of quiet, domestic bliss, a dangerous and beautiful mirage of the life I secretly craved. He hadn't fallen asleep. His eyes were open, staring at some fixed point on the ceiling, but I knew he wasn't really seeing it. His mind was somewhere else. I could feel the subtle tension in his body, a different kind of tension than the usual exhaustion. This was something active, something building. I stopped stroking his hair, my hand freezing mid-motion. The change in rhythm seemed to pull him from his trance. He shifted, turning his head to look up at me. His eyes, dark and deep in the dim light of the living room, were filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. It was a maelstrom of vulnerability, confusion, and a startling, raw need. "Leo," he said, and his voice was so quiet I barely heard it. It was a sound that was not meant to travel, a sound meant only for me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I just looked down at him, my expression probably giving away every secret I had ever kept. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of my composure crumbled to dust. He held my gaze, his own unwavering. The silence stretched, filled with the soft sound of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. It was a silence that was asking a question, A profound and terrifying question. He was waiting for an answer, or perhaps just for permission. He slowly, tentatively, raised a hand to my face. His fingers were cool against my cheek, his touch impossibly gentle. It was not the casual, unthinking touch of a friend. This was deliberate. This was intentional. This was an act of communication, a sentence spoken in a language beyond words. My mind was screaming, a cacophony of warnings and desperate hopes. Pull away. This is a mistake. He's confused. He's heartbroken. You're just a convenience. But another, quieter voice, a voice I had suppressed for years, whispered, "Stay. Just for a second. Stay." And I did. I stayed. I closed my eyes, a silent act of surrender. He took it as the permission it was. He pushed himself up slowly, moving from my lap to sit beside me on the couch. The space between us was now electric, a live wire. He didn't break eye contact. His hand was still on my cheek, his thumb tracing a slow, soft line along my jaw. He was searching my face for something, for a sign of rejection, for fear, for confirmation. I didn't know what he found there, but it must have been enough. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Leo, would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question was a gift. It was a release. He wasn't taking. He wasn't assuming. He was asking. He was giving me the choice, the power to define the moment. He was laying his own vulnerability bare, offering it to me like a fragile, priceless object. In that single, hesitant question, he was acknowledging the precipice we were standing on. He was admitting that this was a crossing, a point of no return. And he was asking me to take the step with him. All the air left my lungs in a rush. The years of silence, of careful observation, of secret pining, all of it coalesced into a single, overwhelming wave of emotion. I couldn't speak. The words were tangled in my throat. So I just nodded. A small, jerky movement. But it was enough. He leaned in, and the last few inches between us felt like a vast, uncharted territory we were exploring for the first time. His lips met mine, and the contact was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative. It was a question. It was soft and hesitant and breathtakingly gentle. It was the kiss of a man who was terrified and yet utterly certain. It was a confession. It tasted of salt and rain and years of unspoken things. I brought my own hand up to his neck, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at his nape, and for the first time, I wasn't just receiving his touch. I was returning it. I was answering his question. The kiss deepened, just slightly, a mutual, silent agreement. It was a promise and a prayer all at once. It lasted for only a few seconds, but it redrew the entire map of my world. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, just breathing, the sound of the rain a gentle witness to the shattering of our old world and the quiet, terrifying birth of a new one. "Okay," he whispered, though it wasn't clear if he was answering his own question or just affirming the reality of the moment. "Okay," I whispered back, the word a shaky echo of his. In that single word, I felt the tightrope I had been walking for months, for years, finally fall away, leaving me not in a terrifying freefall, but on solid, steady ground. For the first time, it felt real. The beautiful, fragile peace of that moment did not last. The dawn that followed the kiss brought with it not clarity, but a thick, suffocating fog of confusion. The aftermath was not a gentle transition into a new reality, but a jarring and painful retreat. It was like watching a photograph develop in reverse, a beautiful, clear image dissolving back into gray ambiguity. When I woke up the next morning, alone in my bed, the apartment was unnervingly quiet. A note was on the kitchen counter, written in Julian's neat, hurried script. "Went for a run. Needed to clear my head." The words were simple, but they felt like a wall being erected between us. When he finally returned, hours later, he was a stranger. The open, vulnerable man who had asked to kiss me was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. He was polite, distant, his movements stiff and unnatural. He avoided my eyes. He kept a careful physical distance, positioning himself on the opposite side of the room, creating a chasm where just last night there had been none. The easy intimacy we had cultivated, the comfortable silence, was shattered. Now the silence was heavy, awkward, filled with the ghost of that kiss. It was a silence of regret. My heart, which had felt so full and certain the night before, began to ache with a familiar, hollow pain. I tried to act normal. I made coffee, offered him a mug. He took it with a mumbled, "Thanks," his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. I felt it like a physical blow. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. That tiny, reflexive action told me everything I needed to know and everything I was terrified to hear. He regretted it. To him, the kiss had been a mistake, a moment of weakness born from grief and loneliness. And I had been the convenient, willing participant in his lapse of judgment. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest withered and died, leaving behind the bitter ash of humiliation. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. Julian found reasons to be busy. He worked late at the office. He made plans with friends I hadn't heard him mention in months. He took phone calls on the balcony, his voice a low, indecipherable murmur. When we were in the same room, the air crackled with a tense, miserable energy. The couch, our former sanctuary, became a no-man's land. We sat on opposite ends, the space between us a memorial to what we had lost. The nightly ritual was dead. He started closing his bedroom door again, the soft click of the latch each night a definitive, heartbreaking punctuation mark at the end of our brief, beautiful chapter. I was drowning in my own internal monologue. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I been too eager? Had my response scared him? Or was this always going to be the outcome? Was I just a temporary fix, a human bandage he had used to cover a wound, now being peeled off and discarded? The pain of it was immense, far worse than the quiet, lonely ache of my unrequited love. That old pain had been manageable, a familiar companion. This new pain was sharp, acute, a betrayal not just by him, but by my own hope. I had allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, and the fall back to reality was brutal. My diary lay untouched beneath the floorboard. What was there to write? How could I put words to this hollow, crushing disappointment? The book had been a place for yearning. I had no language for this kind of grief. After a week of this Cold War, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was louder than any argument. It was eroding the very foundation of our friendship, the one thing I had always treasured. If we were going to lose everything, I decided, it would not be to a slow, silent decay. It would be to the truth. I had to know. I had to hear him say it. I needed the clean, painful cut of his words rather than the slow, festering wound of his silence. I waited for him to come home one evening. He walked in, looking tired, his shoulders slumped. He started to head straight for his room, his usual move in this new, awful dance of ours. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm, stopping him in his tracks. He froze, his back to me. He didn't turn around. "Don't," he said, his voice strained. "Leo, please. Just, let's not." "Let's not what?" I asked, and I could hear the tremor in my own voice, a mixture of hurt and frustration. "Let's not talk about it. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's go back to living like polite, awkward strangers in our own home until one of us finally moves out." He flinched at that last part, the idea of one of us leaving finally verbalized. He turned around slowly. His face was a mask of exhaustion and conflict. He looked lost. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to say the truth," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to keep it level. "Whatever it is, just say it. If it was a mistake, if you regret it, if you were just lonely and I was just there, just tell me. I can take it, but I can't take this. This silence. It's unbearable." I felt my composure cracking, the raw hurt bleeding through. "I feel like a fool, Julian. I feel like I completely misread everything." He looked at me, and for the first time in a week, I saw a flicker of the vulnerability he'd shown me on the night of the kiss. The polite mask slipped, revealing the raw confusion beneath. "You didn't misread it," he said, his voice choked. "That's the problem. You didn't misread it at all." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. "I'm the one who's. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. I'm so lost." He finally confessed. The words came out in a torrent, a dam of confusion breaking. He talked about Clara, about the end of their relationship, how it had felt like his entire future had been erased. He talked about the loneliness, a profound, bone-deep loneliness that his busy social life had always managed to keep at bay. He talked about turning to me, about how my quiet presence was the only thing that felt solid and real in his life. It was like everything else was noise, and you were silence, he said, looking at me with a desperate intensity. And I just wanted to be in the silence. It was the only place I could breathe. Then he talked about the kiss. It wasn't a mistake, he said, shaking his head. When I was leaning in to kiss you, it was the only thing in the world that made sense. It felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. And that's what scares me. It's not supposed to feel right. I'm not. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was trying to say. I'm not gay. I've never been attracted to men. This isn't who I am. His entire identity, his perception of himself, was being challenged by what he felt for me. The kiss hadn't just been a kiss. It was an earthquake that had shaken the very foundations of his world. And his reaction wasn't rejection of me, but a panicked retreat from himself. He was afraid of what it meant. He was afraid of the new territory we had discovered, a place for which he had no map. So you just decided to run away? I asked, the anger in my voice softening into a deep, profound sadness. To pretend it never happened? Did you think that would make the feelings go away? I don't know what I thought, he admitted, his voice ragged. I just panicked. I saw how you looked at me after, so hopeful. And I felt like a fraud. Because I don't know what this is. I don't know what I can promise you. I didn't want to hurt you, Leo. Hurting you is the last thing I ever want to do. So I thought, if I just pulled back, if I put the walls back up, I could protect you from my own confusion. Protect me. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Julian, this past week has been 1,000 times more painful than any truth you could have told me. Your silence hurt me. Your distance hurt me. The way you flinched when I touched you, that hurt me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I don't need your protection. I need your honesty. Even if it's messy, even if it's confusing. I would rather stand in the middle of your hurricane of confusion with you than be locked outside in the cold. My words hung in the air between us. He stared at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The wall he had so painstakingly rebuilt between us crumbled, not piece by piece, but all at once. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. His body shuddered with a sob he could no longer contain. I stood there for a moment, stunned, before my own arms came up to hold him. I held him tightly as the tension and fear and confusion of the past week poured out of him. He wasn't the strong, confident pillar anymore. He was just Julian, lost and scared and clinging to me like a lifeline. And I held him, not as a passive harbor, but as an anchor. This was the honesty I had asked for. It was messy and painful and utterly real. And in the middle of the wreckage, for the first time since the kiss, I felt a flicker of genuine, resilient hope. We had a long way to go, but at least now, we were facing the same direction. It was in the quiet aftermath of that confrontation, in the raw, fragile honesty that followed, that the real moment of truth occurred. It happened a few days later. We were slowly, tentatively rebuilding. The awkwardness was still there, a faint echo in the spaces between us, but it was no longer hostile. It was the careful, gentle quiet of 2 people learning a new language together. We talked more, not just about his confusion, but about everything. About my photography, about his work, about the small, mundane details of our lives that we had stopped sharing. We were rediscovering the foundation of our friendship, examining it to see if it was strong enough to build something new upon. I had gone out to run some errands, and when I came back, the apartment was quiet. I assumed he was in his room. I walked down the hall to my own bedroom, pushing the door open, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting on the floor between my desk and my bed, his back against the wall. The warped floorboard was pulled up, the hollow space beside it empty, and my diary was lying open in his lap. My blood ran cold. The scene was my worst nightmare made real. Every secret, every observation, every pathetic, pining thought I'd ever had about him, exposed. I felt a profound, bottomless sense of violation, followed by a wave of pure, white-hot panic. My first instinct was to scream, to rage, to snatch the book from his hands. But I was frozen in the doorway, paralyzed by the sheer, catastrophic intimacy of the moment. He hadn't noticed me yet. He was completely absorbed, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. The light from the window illuminated his face, and I saw not malice or mockery, but a deep, searching intensity. He was not skimming. He was studying. He was reading my soul. When he finally looked up and saw me, there was no guilt in his eyes. No, I can't explain. He simply held my gaze, his own expression a complex mixture of awe and sorrow, and a kind of dawning recognition. It was the look of a man who has just found the Rosetta Stone for a language he has been hearing his entire life, but never understood. He blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. Then, he looked down at the open book in his hands. He raised one hand and pointed a single, steady finger at the middle of the right-hand page. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, devoid of artifice, a simple, devastating request for confirmation. Is this about me? I walked slowly into the room, my legs feeling unsteady. I stopped a few feet away from him, my eyes fixed on the page he was indicating. I knew exactly which entry it was without even having to read it. It was from a few weeks ago, at the height of the nightly ritual. It wasn't a description of an event. It was one of my more metaphorical, lyrical attempts to capture the feeling of him falling asleep on me. I had compared him to a storm finally breaking, the tension in the atmosphere giving way to the quiet, life-giving rain. I had written about the weight of him being both an anchor and a crushing pressure, the paradox of feeling both safe and trapped. I had described his trust in me as a terrifying, beautiful gift that I felt unworthy of holding. It was, perhaps, the most honest and vulnerable thing I had ever written. I looked from the page to his face. He was waiting, his expression open and patient. The panic inside me began to subside, replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. The worst had happened. My deepest secret was out, and the world hadn't ended. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't disgusted. He was just asking. He was asking me to confirm what he already knew, what he had just spent who knows how long discovering in the pages of my heart. The time for silence, for hiding, for plausible deniability, was over. I sank to the floor, sitting cross-legged in front of him. I took a deep breath. Yes, I said, my voice clear and steady. It's all about you. Every word. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the confirmation. He gently closed the book and placed it on the floor beside him, a gesture of profound respect. He opened his eyes again, and they were shining. All this time, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. All this time, you felt this. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of wonder. Leo, I had no idea. I know, I said softly. That was the point. Why didn't you ever say anything? He asked, a genuine, sorrowful curiosity in his tone. Look at you, Julian, I said, a sad smile touching my lips. Look at how you reacted to a single kiss. You fell apart. You were so terrified of what you were feeling that you tried to bury it, to run from it. What did you think would have happened if I had told you, years ago, that I was in love with you? You weren't ready to hear it. And our friendship, it was too important to me to risk. I would rather have you as a friend in my life than not have you at all. He looked down at the closed journal, his hand resting on the leather cover. I was reading, he began, his voice hesitant, about the night I had that nightmare. About coming into your room. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. You wrote that my fear made your room feel sacred. That you were the keeper of a lighthouse, and I was a ship seeking harbor. You weren't annoyed. You weren't put out. You felt honored. He shook his head in disbelief. I was using you, Leo. I was a mess, and I was using your kindness, your strength, to get through it. You weren't using me. I corrected him gently. You were trusting me. There's a difference. You were lost, and you instinctively came to the one place you knew you would be safe. You didn't know why, but your heart knew. It knew before your head did. I reached out and placed my hand over his on top of the diary. You just needed a map, and I guessed you found 1 inch. Tears welled in his eyes and finally spilled over, tracking silent paths down his cheeks. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry for how I treated you this past week. I was a coward. I was so afraid of this. He gestured between us, at the charged space, at the diary, at the years of unspoken feelings now laid bare. It felt too big, too real, and I didn't think I deserved it. After everything with Clara, I felt broken. I didn't think I deserved to be seen the way you see me. That was the key, the final lock turning. It wasn't about labels. It wasn't about gay or straight. It was about worthiness. It was about a man who felt broken finally allowing himself to be loved, truly and completely, by the person who had seen all his cracks and fissures and had never once looked away. We sat there on the floor of my bedroom for a long time, the rain starting up again outside, a gentle, cleansing sound. We talked. We really talked. He told me about the moment he decided to look for the diary. He said he had felt the shift in me after our confrontation, a new resolve, and he realized he still didn't understand the depth of what he was dealing with. He knew I kept journals, and in a moment of desperate, intuitive searching, he had found the loose floorboard. It was an invasion, a profound breach of trust, but in that moment, it felt more like a necessary act of emotional archaeology. He needed to understand the ruins he was standing in, and he had. The resolution was not a grand, cinematic declaration of love. It was quieter, deeper than that. It was in the way he never let go of my hand. It was in the way he finally, truly saw me, not just as a source of comfort, but as a person with my own deep well of feelings. The ambiguity that had plagued us, that had been a source of both comfort and torment, was gone. In its place was a quiet, terrifying, beautiful certainty. We were no longer a ritual of plausible deniability. We were an intention. That night, he didn't appear at my door with a pillow as a pretext. I found him in my room, already in the bed, the covers turned down on my side. He had closed his own bedroom door for good, not as a barrier between us, but as a final farewell to the life he had lived before. This room was our room now. I slipped into bed beside him, and he immediately rolled onto his side, wrapping an arm around my waist and pulling me close. There was no hesitation, no chaste distance. It was a simple, declarative act of belonging. He tucked his face into my neck, and I felt the dampness of his tears against my skin. "Stay," he whispered against my collarbone, the word a plea and a promise. I wrapped my own arms around him, holding him securely. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. And for the first time in years, the words were not a secret prayer whispered in the dark. They were the truth, spoken aloud in the safety of the home we had finally, truly found in each other. In the weeks and months that followed, we began to build our new normal. It was a process of gentle discovery, of learning the rhythms of this new, intentional togetherness. The grand, terrifying emotions of the confession gave way to the quiet, steady hum of domestic intimacy. The change was most visible in the small things. It was in the way he would reach for my hand while we were cooking dinner, a casual, grounding touch. It was in the way I no longer felt the need to retreat behind my camera to observe him, but could simply exist beside him, sharing the same space, the same light. The couch, once a landscape of anxiety and longing, became a place of simple, uncomplicated comfort. We would still cuddle while watching movies, but now my hand in his hair was not a tentative exploration. It was a familiar comfort. His head in my lap was not a desperate search for peace. It was a statement of belonging. The diary now lives on my bedside table. It is no longer a secret. Sometimes, Julian will pick it up and read a random entry aloud, his voice soft. He doesn't do it to mock my old anxieties, but with a kind of gentle reverence, as if reading a sacred text that explains his own history, a history he was unaware of as he was living it. He calls it our origin story. My photographs of him still adorn the walls, but now there are new ones mixed in. Photos of us. A self-timer shot of us laughing on the couch, tangled up in each other. A picture I took of his hand resting on my knee while I drove. They are no longer just portraits of him, but portraits of us, a concept that still feels new and miraculous. We learned that love is not always a sudden, blinding flash of light. Sometimes, it is a slow dawn, a gradual illumination of a landscape that has been there all along, waiting patiently in the dark to be seen. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we found that we were not broken. We were just beginning.